I've been getting calls every day. It's overwhelming.
Tonight, the search intensifies for Inuit who never made it back home after being taken from their communities and placed in TB sanatoriums. We have the latest developments for the family who live-streamed their newborn baby being apprehended at a Winnipeg hospital.
The increase in risk by 7-fold in terms of the number of tankers.
And BC wants more control over approval of pipelines crossing over provincial lines. Good evening, welcome to APTN National News. I'm Dennis Ward. After publicly battling the child welfare system, one Manitoba family is celebrating a victory. In January, the family live-streamed a newborn baby being apprehended from a Winnipeg hospital. The video went viral shortly after, but today, as Brittany Hobson shows us, the family's fight is over.
The afternoon ended in tears of happiness. After 2 months of child welfare hearings, the family of an infant girl can finally take their baby home. In January, the family live-streamed police and social workers apprehending the baby from a Winnipeg hospital days after she was born. The mother can be seen holding the baby in the video and rocking her back and forth. The video went viral, prompting changes or calls for changes to the child welfare system, especially when it comes to apprehensions. In Manitoba, it's estimated a newborn baby is apprehended every day. The day after, the family called a press conference where the mother shared her story. She said she had made a plan with Child and Family Services to transfer care to her aunt, but that CFS ignored their wishes. Today, that plan became a reality. A Winnipeg judge granted guardianship to the mother's aunt. The mother said that despite the traumatizing experience, she is happy with the final outcome. And the aunt said that she can finally breathe a sigh of relief and is looking forward to spending time with the 2-month-old. Brittany Hobson, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
When Justin Trudeau apologized for how Inuit TB patients were treated between 1940 and 60, it was well received by Inuit. But that good reception was also met with, well, let's see how the follow-up goes. Our Ken Driscoll went to see the person in charge of that follow-up.
For Inuit, this apology from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was the beginning of something, not the end. The apology promised to help Inuit find the remains of loved ones who died in southern sanatoriums during the TB epidemic of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Joanna Siakumalik is the project manager with the Nanilavu project. If you're looking for a grave of a lost one, this is who you call. And people have been calling.
But since then, when the Prime Minister made the official apology, I've been getting calls every day. It's overwhelming.
The job is massive. Over 4,000 Inuit were sent south for treatment. Close to 900 never came back. But the first few days have been promising.
We have officially found one grave in southern Canada. And it looks like we have another one, but we have to confirm everything.
The family who found their lost loved one will be able to travel to the grave, place a tombstone, and gain some peace of mind.
And people are calling from Kitagmi region, Kibadlak, as well as in Kikiptaluk. I'm working on 7 files right now at this moment.
It may take an entire generation before the success or failure of the search for the graves is determined. You can't judge it on a few weeks at the beginning. But those few weeks at the beginning, they're looking pretty promising so far. Ken Driscoll, APTN National News, Iqaluit.
The mouldy homes seen in Cat Lake, Ontario this winter are a reality for First Nations families right across Canada, where overcrowding in poorly built and poorly insulated homes is far too common. But the 2019 budget allocated no new funding to First Nations housing. For those living on remote reserves, there are growing concerns. Their moldy, dilapidated homes are making them sick.
Cross Lake is one of Manitoba's largest First Nations. About 8,000 people live here. A growing community that is outgrowing the housing built here decades ago. Single-family homes which have 2 or 3 generations living under one roof This 3-bedroom house is home to 21.
It's hard because, 21 people, 1 bathroom.
On these northern reserves where supplies for homes cost more, quality is often lost. Many of the houses are poorly insulated. Most have single-pane windows and inadequate ventilation. It leads to mold. In Cross Lake, it's estimated about 50% of the homes have mold, and many believe it's leading to a spike in health problems. 5 children live in this house where black mold is growing in a bedroom and bathroom. Their grandmother is angry and frustrated. She says her grandchildren suffer from asthma and rashes, and she says the mold contributed to this.
This one here, he got his lung removed because of that mold.
Mold and your health.
In 2006, the federal government unveiled a national strategy to address mold in First Nations communities, which included videos like this. 13 years later, in Cat Lake, Ontario, a state of emergency was declared in January due to profoundly poor conditions of housing. In Manitoba this winter, a school on the Matthias Colomb First Nation shut down for 2 months because of mold. Indigenous Services Canada collects information on mold in on-reserve homes, but the information isn't public. The federal government committed $600 million over 3 years in the 2017-2018 budget to repair and build new homes on Canada's 510 First Nations. The chief says the federal dollars account for 11 new homes each year. This large community needs about 600 houses.
Here in this community, Cross Lake, we have 2,000 people homeless.
Cross Lake is surrounded by hydroelectric projects and mines. He says it's time to change how the wealth from Indigenous land is divided.
Sharing revenues so we can have an affordable houses from those instead of begging for federal government to hand over some few dollars.
He wants self-government to generate the dollars here in Cross Lake and spend the money where the community needs it most, giving people what they've been asking for decades: safe and secure homes. Jill Makashon, CTV News, Cross Lake, Manitoba.
The province of BC is looking to block pipelines running through the province. Meanwhile, a group representing more than 100 First Nations says stop killing pipeline projects. Those stories and more coming up after the break.
Todd Lamoran, and here's what's coming up on Nation to Nation. Our political panel of MPs debates the last federal budget before the upcoming election. There was $4.5 billion in new spending. The Parliamentary Secretary for Crown Indigenous Relations calls it a significant step in reconciliation. But significant gaps remain, such as no increase in money for new houses, despite a high-profile housing crisis in the Cat Lake First Nation. And despite trying to avoid it, the SNC Lavalin scandal and resignation of Jody Wilson-Raybould made its way into discussions. That's all coming up after the national news.
Here's a look at Friday's weather forecast starting on the East Coast. Showers and a high of +5 for Halifax and Charlottetown. +5 with showers for Happy Valley Goose Bay. Snow and -1 in Nain. +3 for Montreal. +2 in Quebec City and Saguenay. +2 with a rain-snow mix for Peterborough and Ottawa. +2 with showers for Thunder Bay. Sunny skies and +1 in Sioux Lookout. 0 for Churchill, +7 under the sun for Norway House and Thompson, +2 in Winnipeg and Gimli, 7 above in Dauphin, +11 for Regina and North Battleford, 14 above under sunny skies and Swift Current, +10 in Meadow Lake, 12 above in La Ronge. Welcome back. A case is being heard this week in the British Columbia Court of Appeal that could have a big impact on the Trans Mountain Pipeline. That's because the BC government wants to be able to refuse a pipeline coming through the province if they find it could hurt the environment, human health, or communities. Tina House has the details.
Eugene Kung is a lawyer with West Coast Environmental Law. He says that BC has a lot to lose if there is an oil spill on the West Coast.
Obviously, the increase in risk by 7-fold in terms of the number of tankers with diluted bitumen as cargo is something that's of grave concern for many residents of this area. It's something that the National Energy Board was supposed to have looked at again in their redo, and in my view that was another flawed process, unfortunately.
The BC government is asking the BC Court of Appeal if they have jurisdiction over how much diluted bitumen can be transported throughout the province by either pipeline, tanker, or rail. If the Trans Mountain Pipeline is approved, there will be an increase of 400 more tankers moving throughout the Salish Sea, with daily tankers carrying close to 1 million barrels a day. They currently are moving a third of that amount right now. Joe Foy works with the Wilderness Committee. He's also concerned about the potential risk for BC.
Bitumen is a very different material. It's so thick that to run it through a pipeline, you have to mix it with a substance very like white gas to make it thin enough to go through a pipeline. And that means that this diluted bitumen, diluted with this naphtha-like substance, is very flammable. It's very thick, and when it hits water, there's some things that happen. A lot of gas is off, toxic gases come off, so it's hard for first responders to get in. The material sinks to the bottom of the water, so that's very hard to clean up.
Kung says there are a number of First Nations that are also presenting this week that are for and against the pipeline project.
Supporting BC is Haida First Nation, Heiltsuk First Nation, as well as the AFN and Little Shuswap First Nation. On the other side, we have Lax Kw'alaams, Songhees, and Suk, I believe, and Beecher Bay all together. And they are the ones who are arguing against these regulations.
The 5-day hearing wraps up this Friday. That will determine if the province has final approval on how much bitumen can flow through these waters. Tina House, APTN National News, Vancouver.
Meanwhile, some Indigenous leaders were on Parliament Hill today, speaking out about two pieces of legislation they say will leave their communities in poverty. They say the killing of the Northern Gateway pipeline cost Métis and First Nation communities $2 billion, and say Bill C-48 and C-69 will only deepen the economic losses.
No moratoriums, no killing pipelines, no bills that are guaranteed to lead to endless court challenges.
Bruce Dumont is the past president of the BC Métis Nation. Dumont says the federal government needs to find the balance between the economy and the environment.
40 or so oil and gas producing First Nations are losing $200 million each year in royalties compared to 2012 due to the price differential and the lack of pipeline access for the products. That computes to about $18,000 a year per family.
Dumont and others speaking out about the Oil Tanker Moratorium Act and Impact Assessment Act say tens of billions of dollars in investment is being lost, and that means fewer dollars for social, educational, health, recreational and cultural programs, fewer addiction counselors, less money for housing.
We all know about our suicide rates, addictions, domestic violence, TB, hunger, overcrowded housing. Lots of our people are working on making it to the next week, on just surviving everything that has happened to them. We don't have the luxury of worrying about anything else.
Members of the Aboriginal Equity Partners and Indian Resource Council represent more than 130 Indigenous communities involved in the oil and gas sector. They say the media and politicians are portraying First Nations and Métis as anti-development.
And I want you to think of the consequences of that our neighbors in rural communities of Saskatchewan, Alberta, and BC, who are rig workers, drillers, truckers, tradespeople, they think we are the problem, that we are killing their jobs and their livelihood and their ability to support their families. We also have families to support.
Those speaking out against Bill C-48 and C-69 acknowledge the relationship with the resource sector has not been perfect. but argue it has provided opportunities to exercise self-determination. Stephen Buffalo is the CEO of Indian Resource Council. He's concerned with the expansion of public participation in standing in Bill C-69 and feels only those directly affected by a project should be able to participate.
We don't want to open the door for big environmental NGOs to delay or disrupt projects in our territories.
Buffalo says Indigenous peoples have a long history of being on the short end of the stick when government interferes, and believes it's time to include the economic benefits of Indigenous peoples in their decisions.
This week's federal budget has a whole chapter on advancing reconciliation, and it includes making progress on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's 94 calls to action, including what would appear to be close to $200 million in new funding. For more, we're joined by the director of the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation, Ry Moran. Ry, thanks for joining us. By my count, there appears to be new funding for at least 11 of the calls to action. What do you make of the investments being promised?
You know, I think there's a lot of pretty positive gestures in this recent federal budget, and over a wide variety of calls to action that were called for by the TRC. So if we take a look, well, there are investments made in accountability. There's specific money set aside for the National Council on Reconciliation. That National Council is very critically important. We've often said that that's maybe the most important of all the calls to action because it invests in ongoing accountability, monitoring status of the TRC's calls to action, and the statistics on whether or not this gap that exists in this country is widening or closing. And then we see other really important investments in youth, Jordan's Principle, and even some very important funding for the children that never returned home from the residential schools. So in general, I think it's pretty positive.
There's also funding in there for the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, and I see there's been some movement on that.
Yeah, that's what I think is important to recognize in this budget, is that we are seeing the government try to lock in some of the big pieces, the big ticket items, if you will, that are going to help continue this process of truth and reconciliation in this country for decades or generations to come. So the call for the National Day is being implemented. There's monies being set aside. The government has introduced a bill on that. Again, we come back to the National Council on Reconciliation, very important. And then we also see that corresponding investment in the Commissioner for Indigenous Languages and investments in Indigenous languages. Of course, we know that reconciliation can't occur without Indigenous languages. So these are things that are going to serve us well, not just in the short term, but well into the long term of this country.
And just to note, there was some discussion on what that day was going to be for National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, and it'll be September 30th. Ry, was there anything missing?
Well, you know, there's 94 calls to action. There's always, I think, a general desire to see all of them implemented. You know, when we look again at that National Council for Reconciliation, it's fair to state that the interim board did call for a larger endowment, a larger investment. I think it's going to be really interesting to hear from that interim board how they feel about the monies that have been set aside, how much they feel this enables the realization of the mandate. We have to remember that that National Council is going to be asking for the production of information, statistics, data from municipalities, from businesses, from churches, from provincial governments, you know, from child welfare agencies, from the federal government. So it's got a huge, huge, huge role to play. It was given about $124 million. I think it's going to be a very fair question to ask them whether or not they feel that's enough. They did ask for more. But, you know, it gets us out of the door and it gets something started on that, which is critical.
So, Ry, how would you say the federal government is doing when it comes to its pledge to implement all of the 94 calls to action?
You know, we get asked that question a lot, and I think generally there's some pretty important efforts being made. You know, some of the things that are the big ticket items, again, the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation, we have that, it's stabilizing, it's there. Our mandate is being supported. The National Council, I keep coming back to that. The Indigenous Languages Commission, the National Day for Reconciliation, Jordan's Principle, the huge investments in Indigenous child welfare. I mean, these were real cornerstones of a lot of the work that the Commission called for. Is there more that they can do? Absolutely. Are we going to keep the pressure on every single day? That's our job. But, you know, we have to recognize that, you know, we're still in the early days of this national journey of truth and reconciliation, and if we can get some of these big pieces anchored in, that's going to serve us well, whether it's a Liberal government or a Conservative government or NDP government. These are the pieces, some of these that are real anchor points that I think we should celebrate.
Right, we'll have to leave it there, but appreciate you coming in to talk with us about this.
Thanks very much.
A new episode of APTN Investigates will debut tomorrow night. We've got a preview after the break.
Here's the rest of Friday's weather forecast, picking back up in a sunny northern Alberta. 11 above for High Level, plus 12 for Fort McMurray, 21 above in Medicine Hat, plus 16 under the sun for Calgary, 13 in Vancouver and Victoria, 17 in Kamloops, plus 12 for Dease Lake and Fort Nelson. In the Yukon, minus 6 in Old Crow, plus 12 for Whitehorse and Watson Lake, 10 above in Fort Liard and Trout Lake, plus 3 in Fort Simpson, minus 24 for Sax Harbor, snow and 10 below in Colville Lake, minus 7 for Chesterfield and Whale Cove, 0 in Arviette, minus 27 in Arctic Bay, 26 below.
Welcome back. In this week's episode of APTN Investigates, Indigenous elders and trappers in Northern Ontario are worried about aerial spraying in the woods where they harvest food, fur, and medicine. Here's a preview of poison on our land.
Bob Behrens and Joe Jones are trappers who both have trap lines in the Robinson-Huron Treaty area.
We're going to check her, Joe.
Behrens is from Sault Ste. Marie, and Jones is from Garden River First Nation, and they've both been trapping for more than 30 years.
This is a good box. This is a good set. Nothing today. That's okay.
Both Behrens and Jones are concerned about the practice of aerial spraying glyphosate-based herbicide in the woods out here. In forestry, it's become common to use glyphosate-based herbicide to kill off plants that will compete with newly planted seedlings in areas that have been clear-cut. Glyphosate-based herbicide was developed by Monsanto, and many people have heard of their weed killer marketed under the brand name Roundup. Vision is a Monsanto brand of glyphosate herbicide that is used in forestry.
I was notified by the Ministry of Natural Resources via a letter in 1988 when they were going to spray Vision down on my trap line down the what is known as the Mile 11 Road. I'm not seeing the animals that I did see. I'm not seeing what we call the whiskey jack. I believe he's a Canada jay, the gray jay. We're not seeing those birds, and I'm attributing that to the spraying.
And you can catch that episode right here tomorrow night after the news. And that is your APTN National News for this Thursday. For much more, visit our website, aptnnews.ca, and download the APTN News app. A busy budget week edition of Nation to Nation with Todd Lamarand is just minutes away. I'm Dennis Ward. Have a great night. We'll see you back here tomorrow.